Now, this may seem like an odd topic to you, normalizing failure in experiments, because we don't want failures, of course not, we want success. But there's different kinds of failures, and I made an earlier video about that, about good and bad failures. And the good failures are what I want to talk about here. The good failures come from trying out really new and creative and innovative things that have a high likelihood of failing. And from these failures, you can learn going forward and really discover something fundamentally new. And so the first thing you can ask is, what prevents us from generally doing this? What prevents us from doing this is nobody likes to fail, first of all, is the first point. But of course, we don't like to fail for various reasons, because it is a lot of effort to set up experiments. It can be expensive, it can take a lot of our time, and so therefore we want a payback from this effort. And if you set something up and it's very high risk and has a very high likelihood of failing, this means that you are more likely not going to do it because you are not prepared to pay that price. So this is why we maybe very often don't set up these super risky experiments, and why we rather sort of do experiments that have a safe outcome, where we stay within established paths, basically modify some parameters and do an experiment that we have very high confidence in working out. Now, of course, this is also fine. We need this kind of research as well, and we are doing this as the main part, of course, as well, like everybody else. But I think it's very important to allow for these creative failures. And so what I want to talk about in this video, I'm going to divide into two parts. First is what you can do as a lab, as a team, basically in terms of the culture that you create. And the second bit is what you can do yourself. So let's first talk about what you can do as a lab. Basically, what we can do as a lab is, besides fostering creative discussions, is to also create a culture where failures based on very creative attempts to try out something very new are actually rewarded and appreciated. Now, maybe this is something where we can also learn from artists, because it's often a part of the artistic process to allow failures, and I'm linking to a paper in the description that discusses this point. But what can we actually do is, well, we can encourage people to try things out that are very likely to fail because they're so new and different. And so then, if this actually in the end fails and something was learned from it, and typically is, then we could encourage to share that failure, basically, which is part of that creative process, with the rest of the lab, and make sure that that is valued as much as somebody else's success using a more mainstream kind of method or approach, right? So this means making room in lab meetings for people that have tried something really creative and new, which did not work. Which lessons did they learn from that? And then signaling that you value that attempt and that failure basically as much as somebody having delivered something on a more mainstream experiment. That's doesn't come natural to us, I think, because we generally value success higher than something that has failed. But that may be a way to encourage really people more willing to take that risk if they feel this is actually being appreciated. This is not going to be easy, of course. You could make it part of the lab routine in terms of lab meetings, for example, to have such approaches talked about. But of course, it's kind of difficult to build in rewards beyond sort of the realm of the lab itself and that little microcosm, because in the end, that failure will not be in your CV, right? You will have learned something. In the short term, it will have no positive effects. It might be in a lot of recommendation that this person was very creative and tried new things. But other than that, there is no immediate kickbacks, right? So this is why it's important to have these at least positive feedbacks from the lab team as a whole. And it also is the realization that the success or the positive feedback from that, the payoff may actually be delayed and may come later. It's not an immediate feedback, it's not an immediate gratification of like having had a positive experience from an experiment and results that you can publish, but it is something that will build up over time. And that is the perspective to take with these kinds of creative failures. Now, something that also prevents us from taking these risks of course, grants that fund most of the work we do, where we have certain deliverables and milestones that we need to meet, and we have to deliver on these grants. And that, of course, by very definition, limits the freedom that you can have as a researcher. So therefore, it's important to also establish a culture where once people have basically delivered on their projects, they can also engage in other things and that are more risky and that don't directly address the things in the project. This is, of course, something that you can establish within your lab, or you could go for grants and funding mechanisms that are not so regulated in terms of milestones. There's differences between funding agencies in how much leeway they give you in carrying out a project that you have won. And that is also one way you can create these free spaces for more creative work and the failures that will most likely go along with those. Now, this is what you can do as a team. It's basically just creating this atmosphere that trying something new is good, and that even though you failed, you may have still learned something, and this is rewarded and appreciated. But what can you also do yourself? Well, first of all, the most important thing is that the initial investment should be low, if this is at all possible. So rather than setting up a huge experiment that if it fails, which it most likely will do because it's something totally new, let's say, and then having incurred all this cost and time that is spent on this, rather than doing this, set up a small experiment, set up an exploratory study that maybe tries to explore some of the critical points, why this is likely to fail. You know, maybe you can set up something really small and something really quick that doesn't consume a lot of time and resources, to just have sort of almost like a feasibility study to see if this might work. This is very good to limit the initial investment. So if it fails in the end, it's not that big a deal. What you can also do is try not one thing, but try very many little things. So spread the risks and test the waters basically, and then try out little things what might work, and then just pursue the ones that show promise, right? It's almost like a high throughput way of thinking about experiments, maybe not that extreme, but you know, you could try out various different avenues, how to measure something or how to set something up, and then really only pursue further in the next step the ones that showed some promise. Now, very often this low investment strategy may not work, because what you're doing, it may be inherently expensive, or it may require methods that are just inherently time consuming, and therefore this is not really an option. Then what you can do instead is, rather than doing this on your own, you could find partners, typically within your lab, with whom you could collaborate and say like, well, I have this idea, do you want to help me with this? And maybe you can take over such and such and this, and then in the end you could reciprocate. So I think within a team, if you take advantage of the team opportunities, you can actually get more things done than if you just did it all by yourself. Of course, that means your willingness to share these ideas and then also the risks. But I think this is a very good way out if what you're doing is inherently just expensive, complicated, time-consuming, and difficult. Well, these are some of the things that I think you can do as a team as a whole, and also you individually as a person, to engage in more creative failures, basically, and to accept those as a step towards making progress. And I think the most important thing is that really this is not so conducive to the instant gratification that I am just as guilty of as everybody else. We want those immediate results. We want to move on. We want to have this feeling of joy when something works, right? So I think it takes everybody's effort, I think, to make that adjustment. And it's also not for everybody. You know, there is different degrees of willingness to take on risk, and this is fine. But I think this is for labs or for individual people that would like to try out more difficult things, more, let's say, more out there kind of things, which are very likely to fail, because I think there are rewards for this out there. And yeah, we need to recognize these first steps that lead to these kinds of ways of making progress. And with that, I hope you have some great ideas and you find yourself a great team to explore them with. See you. Bye.